Welcome back to another revision tutorial with Miss Sweet. Today we are exploring the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen in great detail. Wilfred Owen was a poet who wrote about the horrors of war from his experience serving in the British Army during World War I. He loved writing from an early age and became an English teacher in France. He was sent to fight in France in 1917, but was hit by a shell explosion. The same explosion killed his best friend, and Wilfred was left devastated. He started suffering from shell shock. This was when soldiers started to act strangely because of the noise, fear, and danger of war. By 1917, most of mainland Europe was involved in World War I, the largest and deadliest war the world had ever seen at the time. Trench warfare was a major part of World War I military tactics, which Owen references here by referring to soldiers cringing in holes. The space between opposing armies' trenches, so-called no man's land, was filled with barbed wire. Poor sanitary conditions in the trenches contributed to the spread of disease, and exposure during winter months was a common killer. The term shell shock emerged from the war, in reference to soldiers suffering with what would now be termed PTSD. Owen himself was hospitalized in Edinburgh to treat his shell shock. Owen and many others also strongly criticized the war for what they saw as unnecessary loss of life. After his hospitalization in Edinburgh, Owen returned to the front lines of the war in the fall of 1918 and died on November 4, 1918, 1 week before the armistice declaring the end of the war was signed. The poem consists of 8 stanzas, each with 5 lines. While these stanzas could be classified as quatrains, they more closely resemble quatrains, with an additional concluding line. The first 4 lines of each stanza utilize similar rhyme schemes to depict the horrors of war, while the 5th line refers to dying. This concluding line serves to contextualize the preceding lines, suggesting that the suffering and death portrayed ultimately lead to no meaningful change. The consistent structure of the stanzas lends the poem a sense of order and cohesion. This deliberate arrangement mirrors the military setting. Exposure exhibits a lack of consistent meter, with most lines containing between 12 and 15 syllables, while the last line of each stanza is shorter, ranging from 5 to 7 syllables. This irregularity contributes to a sense of uncertainty and instability, reflecting the soldiers' anxiety as they wait on the front lines. Despite the overall irregularity, the poem features notable rhythmic moments. For instance, the opening line, "Brains ache," employs 2 successive stresses, mimicking the sensation of a throbbing headache. Similarly, line 8 utilizes multiple dactyls, with the rhythm of northward, incessantly echoing, flickering, gunnery. In the poem's final lines, "All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens," a trochaic meter emerges, contrasting sharply with the previous irregularities. In contrast to its inconsistent meter, Exposure features a relatively stable rhyme scheme, with the first 4 lines of each stanza adhering to an abac pattern. Examples include pairs like "nervous" and "silent/salient." This use of slant rhyme creates a jarring, disquieting effect, reflecting the soldiers' alienation from the idealized notions of war presented to the public. The use of the word "our" indicates a shared experience among the soldiers, emphasizing camaraderie in suffering. This collective pronoun fosters a sense of unity in their plight, suggesting that the pain is not isolated to one individual, but is a communal condition. Shell shock, now understood as a form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested in various symptoms, including headaches, tremors, anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Owens himself was diagnosed with shell shock. The words "merciless," "iced," and "east winds" conjure a sense of biting cold and relentless exposure to the elements. This personification of wind suggests that nature is actively hostile, contributing to the soldier's suffering rather than providing relief or comfort. The verb "knive" introduces a violent connotation to the phrase. This choice of word evokes sharpness and pain, suggesting that the cold winds are inflicting suffering. The imagery of being knifed by the wind creates a sense of assault, emphasizing the brutal conditions the soldiers face. The east wind is frequently mentioned in biblical texts, often associated with calamity or divine intervention. For example, Exodus 10 verses 13 to 15 describes how the Lord sent a strong east wind to bring locusts upon Egypt, emphasizing the destructive power of the wind. Ezekiel 17 verse 10 refers to the east wind as a force that can dry up vegetation and lead to desolation. Jonah 4 verse 8 describes a vehement east wind that caused Jonah great distress, linking the wind to a moment of personal suffering and turmoil. These references highlight the east wind as a symbol of God's power and, at times, His judgment, suggesting that natural elements can reflect spiritual truths or human suffering. The violence and bayonet charge is human-made, rooted in the brutality of war. The soldier is bombarded by the physical and psychological effects of war, and nature, in this context, is a victim of human conflict. Images like bullets smacking the belly out of the air reflect the violent intrusion of war on the natural world, highlighting how human violence disrupts and damages the environment. Nature in bayonet charge appears as collateral damage to human violence. However, in exposure nature is personified as violent and the cause of the soldiers' deaths. The image of the yellow hair is startling and unusual, injecting a sense of surrealism into the poem. The hare, a fragile and innocent creature, contrasts sharply with the brutal environment of war. Its sudden appearance disrupts the soldiers' focus on survival, adding to the chaotic and surreal nature of the battlefield. The color yellow often symbolizes cowardice, decay, or illness, which could reflect the degradation of the natural world due to war or symbolize the soldier's own fear and panic. The hare can be seen as a symbol of the vulnerability and helplessness of life, caught in the destructive forces of war. Its erratic movement and desperate behavior mirror the soldier's own disoriented state. Hares are prey animals, suggesting that both the hare and the soldier are at the mercy of forces beyond their control, symbolizing the arbitrary and destructive power of war. The image of the hare crawling and threshing creates a sense of desperation and suffering. Threshing typically refers to the violent separation of grain, suggesting that the hare's movement is painful and chaotic. The circle imagery also implies futility. No matter how hard the hare struggles, it is trapped in an endless loop of pain and fear, much like the soldier is trapped in the cycle of war and violence. The hare's circular movement suggests an inescapable cycle of violence, both for the animal and for the soldier. This can be interpreted as a comment on the futility of war, where both human and non-human life are caught in a destructive and meaningless loop. This image of the hare with its mouth open but silent is haunting and adds to the eerie, disquieting atmosphere of the poem. The juxtaposition of the visual image of a wide-open mouth with the auditory absence of sound creates a powerful tension, emphasizing the hare's suffering. This silence may represent the inability of the animal, and by extension, the soldier, to express the horror and pain it is experiencing. The silence also reflects the numbing, dehumanizing effect of war, where even the most visceral cries for help go unheard amidst the chaos. The silence of the hare is symbolic of the soldier's own voicelessness and powerlessness in the face of war. This image might also suggest the broader silencing of individuals during wartime, where the horrors experienced by soldiers often go unspoken or are impossible to articulate. It serves as a metaphor for the inexpressible trauma of war, where pain and suffering exist but cannot always be communicated or understood. In contrast, in Wilfred Owen's poem Exposure, nature is depicted as a formidable force that causes the suffering of soldiers in World War I. Owen employs vivid imagery and sensory detail to illustrate how nature, rather than providing solace, becomes an adversary that exacerbates the soldier's torment. The personification of the wind as merciless emphasizes nature's cruelty, stripping away any notion of refuge or comfort. Additionally, the repetitive refrain "but nothing happens" underscores the soldier's feelings of helplessness and stagnation, suggesting that even the harshest elements of nature fail to incite action or change their grim reality. Through this portrayal, Owen critiques not only the brutality of war but also the desolation of a natural world that offers no respite, reinforcing the theme of alienation and the futility of human endeavor in the face of overwhelming and uncaring natural forces. In Exposure, the mention of brambles conjures images of thorny, tangled vegetation that can ensnare and injure those who come into contact with it. I believe it can be linked to the symbolism of the crown of thorns Jesus wore during his ultimate sacrifice/crucifixion. This connection to the crown of thorns highlights the sacrificial nature of the soldier's plight. Just as Christ's crown of thorns symbolizes suffering and sacrifice for the sake of humanity, the soldier's torment reflects their own sacrifices made in the name of duty and honor, yet they remain overlooked and forgotten. Throughout the poem, there are links to death and sacrifice, with religious undertones. Let's explore more. In Christianity, dawn is often associated with the resurrection of Christ, marking a moment of triumph over death and sin. However, in Exposure, the poignant misery of dawn subverts this notion, transforming what should be a moment of hope into a reminder of the soldier's ongoing suffering. Instead of heralding renewal, the dawn signifies the continuation of their torment, underscoring the futility of their sacrifices. This inversion suggests a spiritual desolation, where the promise of redemption is rendered hollow amid the relentless realities of war. From the outset, the motif of death permeates the poem. Phrases that allude to dying, such as the refrain "but nothing happens," juxtapose the anticipation of death with the paralysis of their situation. Owen's portrayal of death is not heroic. Instead, it is depicted as an indifferent and often random occurrence. By repeating references to death throughout the poem, Owen critiques the romanticized notion of sacrifice in warfare. The soldiers' deaths are treated as mere statistics in the larger machinery of war, emphasizing a disconnect between their suffering and the perceived glory of battle. Tennyson adopts a celebratory tone, honoring the soldiers for their patriotic sacrifice. Even though the poem acknowledges the tragedy of the military blunder, it never questions the value of the soldiers' actions. Instead, it glorifies their commitment to duty, framing their sacrifice as part of a larger narrative of national pride and honor. Tennyson's language, such as glory and honor, reflects an idealized view of patriotism, presenting it as something worthy of respect and admiration. The poem's patriotic tone is tied to the collective heroism of the Light Brigade. Their sacrifice is meant to inspire future generations. It is worth noting Tennyson was the official poet laureate at the time of the Crimean War. If he criticized the war, it would have been considered as treason. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful.